On the last day of 2022, parish orphans and retrogrades, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI has died. You know this by now. I was actually awake when it was announced in Central Standard Time. It was nearly 4 a.m. Don't ask me why I was still awake. Long day yesterday, which ended in the strangest way imaginable. Pope Benedict Emeritus has died. What does it mean for a Pope Emeritus to die? I discussed that in a show 2 days ago. It's not the same because we're not going to have the duties going to the Camerlingo. All the duties of death of a former pope will go to an already elected pope who's been ruling for 10 years. Strange end to a strange day. And I'll tell you what, lots of people probably already went live this morning, have talked about it. I had tons of texts on my phone when I looked down this morning at around lunchtime, late morning, early noon. And they're saying, did you know Benedict? Well, I tweeted about it 5 minutes after I heard last night at almost 4 a.m. So yes, but I didn't want to get up and go live. I considered going live on the death of Benedict late last night, but no one's going to be watching and I hadn't thought about it enough. So oftentimes here on Rules for Retrogrades, particularly in light of news like this, it makes due sense to wait a couple of hours and have extra analysis, have thought about it, processed it being any news, particularly news like this, for even 90 or 120 minutes more. No need to be first. What I'm going to talk about on today's memorial episode for Benedict will reference the show that I did 2 days ago on Thursday. So go watch that show if you haven't. Couple it with this one. I was preparing for an imminent death of Benedict XVI when I did that show. So this will couple with that show very nicely. But I do want to give a thematic overview, the way I did a really fast historical overview. And both that show and this one should point at the meaning of the Benedict pontificate, which is profound, yet not profoundly hopeful. It's profoundly insinuative that tough times are ours and may be coming. That's not the cheerful sentiment you hope to hear expressed on the last day of a new year, as we will be watching the ball drop tonight and entering into 2023 with hopeful New Year's resolutions and hearts full of good tidings and brotherly love. But it's a fact. It's ours. It is ours. This day is ours, and we must deal with it. So let's get on to, I think, the 5 most meaningful aspects of Benedict's pontificate in half a minute. First, please like this video, subscribe to this video, click the notification bell. That's how we get recurring viewers like you, good parish orphans and retrogrades. This is how the meaning of the channel, the cultivation of a bold yet faithful Catholicism, bold yet faithful traditionalism, really takes root, is to have viewers. And that's our approach to everything here on Rules for Retrogrades. Bold yet faithful traditional Catholicism that's in the world but not of the world. So like and subscribe and click the notification bell for this video. Leave a comment. Please just say a good word. Let's all open with a prayer for Benedict as we start. We'll do so now in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, it is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Okay. Now, there are reports from Hillary White on Twitter that the Piazza of Vatican is empty because taped off.
There's like tape. They're not letting people go up to it.
Meaning what? What do you... That's strange. That's strange. I had a question pitched to me this morning by text saying, Tim, do you think this is real? I don't trust anything anymore, you know? Is Epstein even dead? I don't know. But Benedict was 95. So even though we trust very little in what we hear, if anything, from mainstream media at this point. I mean, he was a 95-year-old man. As we're going to talk about in my last point, Benedict retired almost 10 years ago because of health reasons, on account of faltering health. Now, there's both vindicating set of propositions rattling around somewhere in there and some falsifying propositions. He lived 10 years. Yes, I know. But he was 85, and he is now 95. So he's passed on. Accept that much. I don't know what it means that Hillary White is reporting that the Vatican Piazza, rectangular piazza, is empty, presumably because taped off. Right now, who is this? Who is that being interviewed? I'm looking at Twitter.
Piazza's empty, where in the past times it's always been filled with people praying.
It's strange. It's not a COVID stipulation, which is emboldening the Vatican to keep the piazza empty. So what is it? I don't know. Anyone who has any thoughts on this, feel free to comment. That broke since I started. So I'm open to suggestions. That's where it's very helpful to have comments, actually. When I go live on something that's breaking, people can help to update. But the 5 aspects of Benedict's pontificate that I want to talk about are these 5. They go through his pontificate chronologically. Number 1, the dictatorship of relativism, which he announced as Pope right when he became Pope in 2005. He set squarely his pontificate in opposition against what he said is the number one pernicious danger in the world today, which is the dictatorship of relativism. I'm going to talk about that for a little bit. Secondly, the Regensburg Address. People tend to forget about the Regensburg Address from 2006, the second year of his pontificate, when they start issuing note bene, as to what are the main notes of the Benedict pontificate. And they forget about the Regensburg Address from the second year, 2006. Thirdly, Summorum Pontificum, which is the summer of 2007, the third year of his pontificate. No, I'm not doing every year. This always gets the highlight reel. This always makes the tape as the bequeathment of the Benedict pontificate to posterity. And of course, it well should. We're going to talk about it as well. But don't forget about number 2, Regensburg. Number 4, an aspect of the pontificate that we did not learn about until ex post facto was the Sankt Gallen Mafia, which both antedated it. The Sankt Gallen Mafia was meeting 9 years fully before Benedict became Pope in 2005. And it seems to have been very operative in the years since Benedict has retired. And the Sankt Gallen Mafia might have been that efficient cause which secured his retirement. We'll talk about that, number 4. So Sankt Gallen Mafia doesn't really post-date to 05, 06, 07, like numbers 1, 2, and 3, or any year after that. It's before it. And number 5 is his retirement, which is strange. It's ecclesiologically strange, at the very least. And his role as a barrier to deep church and the New World Order. So 5 is his retirement and his role as a barrier to the New World Order in the church, which seem to have something of an adversarial relationship, these two notes of what I'm calling the 5th element of his pontificate. And that everything that I could say about Benedict XVI is a bit tortured. I admit it. There's nothing that is full-throatedly optimistic or joyful or positive, even though most of us agree. Cardinal Ratzinger, particularly the CDF under John Paul II, offered much that was very helpful. And the early Benedict pontificate looked very full of promise. That's soured over the last few years, and I want I want to say prayers for this holy man, not just today, but for the next days and weeks. And I hope you, parish orphans and retrogrades, will join me in so doing. But I want to have a realistic look at what the meaning of the Benedict pontificate is. Because before we go back to number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, people out there get bourgeois mushy when someone dies and start canonizing someone on their day of death. It's appropriate to celebrate what was heroic in the man, Joseph Ratzinger, and what was heroic in his pontificate. But it's not appropriate to issue an unfaithful, inauthentic canonization simply because the man died early this morning, America time. I mean, we are now left to an abusive stepfather, as we have been for nearly 10 years. But I feel like today is the dawn of the final phase of the Francis pontificate, which he's probably been waiting for, Francis. And I fear that he will, as boxing commentators say, open up on our ribs now, we the faithful, even more than he's been doing over the last 2 or 3 years. It's a new day. It's a new day. The sun has fully set now on the Benedict era. It's a new era. It is fully the Francis era. And this is not a cheerful thing to say. So we were left to Francis. And now we feel more remotely, more fully at the feet of a Francis pontificate that, to whatever extent this man, this unmerciful pontiff, Francis, was holding anything back, any punches back in respect to Benedict XVI. Luckily, he already threw a lot of his punches, and he doesn't seem to hold back much, Francis. But to whatever extent he was doing this, he will no longer do it. The question is, does Francis have any restraint at all? Was he holding any punches back? I mean, let's get into number 1, and then number 2, and then number 3. Sequentially, Francis was undoing these things that meant so much to Benedict. Number 1, whereas Pope Francis's first really public statement in office in the first 2 or 3 weeks was that we're talking too much about issues of the loins and about abortion. We're whining about it too much, essentially. That's what Francis says. Benedict's first really public statement in office, there were 2 that are both famous, and one actually predates to his last days in the CDF. I think it was 3 months before he became Pope, he said, and he repeated again as Pope. So 2 comments. One, he said, always pray for me that I will not lose courage before the wolves of Rome, which seems to have happened in his late pontificate. But secondly, I wanted to talk about this remark that he says the greatest peril in the world today is the dictatorship of relativism. That's really issue number 1. That's what we have to talk about. Contrast that with Francis. He wants to avoid the dictatorship of relativism, whereas Francis's first public statement embraces, in soft terms, a dictatorship of relativism. Well, that's not good. And unfortunately, Ratzinger, the man, Benedict, Pope Emeritus, whatever you want to call him, ought to have known that the likely runner-up, his likely, the likely next Pope, number 266, after Benedict 265, was going to rebut him. So when he says the greatest threat to the church and the world is the dictatorship of relativism, what he's really saying is people who assert, whether they're philosophy or logic professors or mothers and fathers who are setting a bad example for their sons and daughters, who assert that a moral proposition can be good to person A and bad to person B, are correct. That this is a propositionally valid statement. What he really means is the Christian morality is true. And that's a good thing for a pope to say when he becomes pope. And as you now know, Francis, who says that essentially we're talking too much about these obvious grave evils, sex sins, and the murder sin against the most innocent that follows upon sex sins, two greatest evils really ever, murder and sex sins, which lead to them, are not so bad. They're bad, but they're not so bad. This sounds like an embrace of the very relativism that was decried by Benedict. So I'm not going to talk about Francis. I do that every other show. I've talked a lot more about Pope Francis before my camera, before the screen, in front of you guys, parish orphans and retrogrades, than Benedict. So it's different to be talking about him. I was, just so everyone out there knows this, you probably assume it, because you were the same way most likely, quite a Benedict enthusiast. In 2005, when he says, I want to declare a war on the dictatorship of relativism. And then he published a book with an Italian philosophy professor named Marcello Pera. And he talked about relativism. He also talked about Islam. I was fully behind this guy. His nickname was the Pope's Rottweiler from the last days as the prefect of the CDF. Why had he earned that nickname in those last days as the prefect of the CDF? For a really, really hard doctrinal stance out of the dicastery, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, against South American Marxist theology. I like it. I liked it. I was an enthusiast. I was pumped. I was ready to go. I read his book with Marcello Pera. He's talking about the dictatorship of relativism. He comes out with his powder dry and his guns blazing, and I was psyched. Now, going into the second year and the second element of the Benedict pontificate, it was actually late in the year. It was September the 12th, 2006. I remember it because I was teaching. I just begun teaching at Catholic school for the first time. I taught at public school for a year and hated it. And it was my first, a month into my first year teaching theology at a Catholic school, which I loved. The Catholic school I would return to after law school and my degree in Rome. My degree in Rome, by the way, has Benedict's name on it. I'm looking at it right now. It's making me sad. I have a window to his name right now. Yeah, I'll show you. Yeah, why not? Why not show you? I would leave after 1 year at that Catholic school that I loved, only to return many years later after going to Rome, not completing the PhD because of what happened with Abby's health condition, and then going to law school instead. And this is my degree. It is a pontifical licentiate, and it is beautiful. And I was so honored to have Benedict's name. Let's see if we can.
Do you want to point to his name there? I don't know.
Where is it? Why?
Let me do it.
Maybe off screen. We need a little pointer.
His name is right here.
Yeah. I have a lot of degrees, and none of them have, and I have a lot of degrees from, thank you, Steffi. I have a lot of degrees from Catholic schools, and this is the only one because it's a pontifical university that had the Pope's name. So in the second year of his pontificate, now I was working for the church, teaching at Garces, the school, which I would go back to eventually and teach at for 6 additional years. And, what happened? Oh, okay. And he issues this Regensburg address, which is facially about Islam. And it got press coverage because on September the 12th, 2006, it had just been the 5-year anniversary the day before of 9/11, which was, 9/11 was allegedly about Islam. Or no, I'm not so sure about that anymore, but that's what everyone believed at the time, or led to believe. And the long and the short of it is, it was the most beautiful document, the Regensburg Address, given at Regensburg, where he was a rector and a professor for 20 years, about the history of philosophy. Today, on the last day of the year, 2022, if you have 15 minutes, go and read the Regensburg Address. You will learn about the history of philosophy. Specifically, even though it starts out about Islam, Paleologus, who was an Eastern emperor, doing dialogue with a Muslim, saying, all you ever brought to the world was the sword. You brought nothing new that Christianity didn't already have. And that made Muslims go set more things on fire in other parts of the world. That's a true story. That wasn't what it was really about. Benedict quickly gets to, by the second page of the address, 6 or 7 page address, he gets to the question, well, what was new about Christianity? What was new about Christianity is that it baptized Aristotelianism. And he calls this the Western civilization's Hellenization, Christian Hellenization. And he says what's happened over the last 500 years, largely because of his native Germany and its thinkers, has been a 3-step process of de-Hellenization. The first step, and by de-Hellenization, he means the uncoupling of Christianity from Aristotelianism, which is accountable basically for all good natural things in the world. The coupling of Christianity with Aristotelianism. The first wave of de-Hellenization, de-Aristotelianization, was Luther and Calvin, who hated Aristotle. Luther and Calvin themselves. They were the first wave of de-Hellenizing Christianity, de-Aristotelianizing Christianity. In some senses, you might say re-Platonizing Christianity, but I think I'm more hostile to Plato than Benedict is, and so I might be superimposing some of my own views. He's saying getting rid of Aristotle from Christianity, which Luther, who called Aristotle the buffoon who ruined Christianity a priori, or something like that. I think Benedict would say, and Plato too, was being pulled out of Christianity, even though there's less Platonism in Christianity than most people have been led to assume. Happened by Luther and Calvin themselves, who both hated Aristotle, who hated the Aristotelian, especially Calvin, not so much Luther, Zwingli, the Aristotelian explanation for transubstantiation of the Eucharist. They hated the phenomenon, the reality of transubstantiation itself. And they hated the fact that Aristotle had given Christianity so many tools for explaining mysteries. That's what hylomorphism is all about. And the second wave, according to Benedict, of de-Hellenization was what he called liberal Protestant theology, specifically out of the German schools of Tübingen, which were rife with German idealism, Kantianism and Hegelianism, which led to thinkers like Feuerbach and Schleiermacher, all kinds of names that sound like I have a bad cough. And they further uncoupled deeply, deeply, deeply true, deeply, deeply, deeply Christian theories of hylomorphism, that form is in matter, further. They embedded the world more thoroughly with false German idealism, the idea of the subject swallowing the object whole. You have to understand history, philosophy much, but this was bad German philosophy, which was creeping into make bad German theology, which is why I think theology is mostly so bad today. It's been infected with Kant, Hegel, Feuerbach, Schleiermacher, Fichte, Schelling. It's really bad. Really, really bad. And that happened mostly at a school in Germany called Tübingen, but it was other schools in Germany, universities. So Benedict, a German, is critiquing Germany twice with the 2 first waves or moments of de-Hellenization. And it's great, quick, fast philosophy lessons. John Paul II was a philosophy professor. Benedict was a theology professor, and I always found Benedict's teachings on philosophy much more illuminative than John Paul II's. John Paul was a phenomenologist. He was confused as a philosopher, deeply confused. Benedict, who was not even a philosopher, had a much more clear grasp of what had gone on. And the third moment of de-Hellenization is ongoing. He's saying it's cultural pluralism and cultural relativism, which comes from cultures not being able to be like, hey, we're American. Here's our culture. It's Christian. Say Merry Christmas. America should be smaller, and then it would be easier to keep it pure. Say, hey, we're Little Malta. We're Catholic. Cultural pluralism is the main mechanism in the late 20th century, says Benedict, and the early 21st century for moving forward the third wave of de-Hellenization, which is pluralism. Pluralism. big cultures, moving pluralism, which moves forward the dictatorship of relativism. So the Regensburg Address, great 6 or 7 pages on the history of philosophy that opened my eyes. The year before I went to Rome, partly inspired by the Regensburg Address, to go do more graduate studies of philosophy, more Catholic ones than I'd done. I already had a master's degree in philosophy. I'm going to travel across seas with my wife. We didn't have kids until we went to Italy, and get a doctorate in this stuff. I was pumped to go get a doctorate with his name on it and do more Catholic stuff, not just flitty continental philosophy, which is what my master's had been in. The Regensburg Address pumped me up. I was reading philosophy again, even though I'd been out of the master's program for 2 years, largely because Benedict's clarity, his moral clarity, his ontological clarity, his history of philosophy lucidity, made me want to read philosophy at night. And the next year, I traveled to Italy, stopped working, was working on what we'd saved up, and was working toward a doctorate and a licentiate. The third year, actually the summer before we were ready to go, the next year, school year goes from fall to spring, we were getting ready to actually leave American shores. Well, that school year passed. I was working in the summer to earn some money so that we could go over there and not be too strapped, when Summorum Pontificum, the third element of Benedict's pontificate, came out. And the funny thing is, I've reported this widely. I don't have a direct record, but I remember going to the Latin Mass at a big diocesan church, the one where I'd been baptized, in Bakersfield since at least that spring, if not the previous fall, which would have been early 2007, late 2006. People challenged this. That's just definitely the way both Steph and I remember it. So a little before Summorum Pontificum, which universalized permission for the faithful to return to Latin Mass. Anywhere the faithful wanted it, they did not need the bishop's permission, said Summorum Pontificum. It was a permission granted by Benedict XVI to TLM Catholics like me and you, parish orphans and retrogrades, to do it basically anytime, even if your bishop was a tyrant. And that happened the summer, 2 months before we left for Italian shores. I think it was in July, maybe it was in June of 2007. But Summorum Pontificum is the main thing that trads are remembering Benedict for, and you're hearing that plenty of that on other channels, and I'm certainly grateful for it. Though, like I said, we were going to the Latin Mass before Summorum Pontificum, just by a little bit. We weren't going to the Latin Mass a couple years before when we got married. It was in 2006 or earlier 2007. Very strange. Strange memory to have. And I've looked for ways to verify that memory, but it is what it is. Summorum Pontificum is the third element from the third year of his pontificate. He came out strong. Dictatorship of Relativism, and that book he published with Marcello Pera. Relativism coupled with Islam in 2005. Boom, great statement on it. Second year, Regensburg Address. Relativism, anti-relativism, anti-dehellenization speech coupled with an anti-Islamic violence talk in the second year. That's what Regensburg was. You should go read it today. It's very short. The Regensburg Address. I used to make my high schoolers read it, and they loved it. Third year, Summorum Pontificum. Now he gives the Latin Mass back to the faithful. The reform of the reform that he'd written about as Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger suddenly seemed all too real. In bright, explicit colors, the reform of the reform no longer sounds like the pipe dream of an aging, traditional, friendly intellectual. And now it suddenly is a real thing. You can touch it, you can see it, you can smell it when you can go to Latin Mass, even under a gay, effeminate bishop who doesn't like it. Thank you, Benedict. Those are the first three elements, really strong. And then I went to Italy and during his fourth year, and I was there, and I attended 3 or 4 big pontifical masses, which I was excited to do. He was a real intellectual hero of mine still at the time. And then he started cooling his jets. Then we started in that fourth year. I remember this well because I was a Catholic slowly coming back to the church this whole time. Not that slowly. This is when I was coming back to the church. He started talking more about the environment in that 4th year, into the 5th year, into the 6th year. Then there started being leaked reports and leaked video of Benedict being denied handshakes by fellow German bishops when he came home from an airplane trip abroad. Remember that video? Did we ever show this video on this channel?
Yes.
His fellow German bishops and Belgian bishops wouldn't shake his hand.
It was heartbreaking.
It's heartbreaking to watch. It's rough stuff. What, you know, it's bad to watch. I hate it. I started noting something wasn't right in the state of Denmark. And there wasn't really any other strong note of the pontificate. He prayed sincerely for strength to resist the wolves of Rome in one of his first statements. His first 3 years were really strong, self-consistent, consonant, one note with another. And then he fell off. So the 4th element of the Francis pontificate is not another strong one. There's nothing else really strong that his pontificate stands for as a proposition, which will issue forth into posterity. Everything else gets negative. The wolves of Rome seem to have overpowered him. The St. Gallen Mafia is the 4th element, and I have talked no small amount about it on this channel. There's nothing funny about it. From 1996 to 2004, these fellow Germans and Swiss and Austrian and Belgian and Northern French prelates met, and some of them were bishops, most of them were cardinals, met under the waning days of John Paul II's 27-year pontificate, and they discussed how do we avoid CDF Ratzinger becoming pope. How do we do it? And in the early days of the St. Gallen Mafia, 1996, 1997, they're meeting in Switzerland there, and the heir apparent from their hopeful perspective, the bad guys, was Cardinal Martini himself, who Time magazine, you can go look at a Time magazine cover saying the anti-pope, and it's not anti-A-N-T-I, it's A-N-T-E. Is he the pre-pope, which has a lot of different meanings. But he was speculated even by the secular liberal press as the next pope, and he was the hope, Martini. Instead of Ratzinger, Rome's bulldog, its doctrinal chief, who was known as a conservative and a traditionalist, they were hoping to put Martini in. Now, this was during that period, 96, 97, 98, 99, 2000, when John Paul II was succumbing, we are told, to Parkinson's disease. Well, just a couple years after it became really apparent that JP2 was succumbing to Parkinson's, so did Martini start showing signs publicly. He might have known for years, as did JP2, of succumbing to the same disease, Parkinson's. Strange historical anomaly or whatever. I mean, they're both old. It's not like they got early onset Parkinson's. But it's a weird note in history. The haters of JP2 hated him most for his doctrinal chief, Ratzinger, who was, by most measures, more of a theological conservative than Quran-kissing JP2. With, Christian feminism reifying JP2. Ratzinger, what was conservative about the JP2 pontificate? Yes, I think the man, John Paul II, disliked communism intestinally as a second nature. He genuinely, from his own character and his own experiences, he had formative memories by which he formed a legitimate disdain for communism. That's cool. But I think all of the doctrinal stuff that he did that is in any way traditionalist, JP2, which isn't tons, came from Ratzinger. And the St. Gallen Mafia guys knew it. They knew it. They knew Ratzinger would be worse than JP2, which is why they met 8 or 9 years in a row This is only what we know. It's tip of the iceberg, 10%. According to the ones that have spoken about it, they met to avoid a Ratzinger pontificate. And I've seen the videos of his later pontificate, like the return flight home where the German bishops wouldn't shake his hand. They leave him hanging, as we say when we're going for a high five. So Martini starts succumbing to the same thing that JP2 was. JP2 is not dying, though, as the 90s become the new millennium. And now the Sankt Gallen group gets a new head, Achille Silvestrini. Another character who makes the pages of Windswept House by Malachi Martin. Very interesting stuff. And Silvestrini, I believe, Julia Maloney, if you're watching, feel free to correct me in the comments. She's kind of, in my view, has the final word on this at this point. He is the one that was really saying, we should get Bergoglio. We should get this guy Bergoglio for what eventually became the 2005 conclave, which gave us Pope Benedict. Even though he's an unknown, perhaps because he's an unknown, we will be able to do what we want to do, to change the church, make the remaining Roman Catholic Church into the Lutheran Church. It's not enough that Germany is more Lutheran than Catholic. We want to make all the world more Lutheran than Catholic. And the one guy to do this will be Mario Jorge Bergoglio. And guess what? I mentioned this in the last video. Is the fourth element of the Benedict pontificate. I never lied to you guys. I tell you the good. I was a Benedict enthusiast in the first half of his pontificate, 8-year pontificate. First 3 or 4 years. In the second half, it starts slipping. It starts slipping. And where's it going with that? I was going to tell a story about the Sankt Gallen Mafia. I'm forgetting what it was.
You're asking Julia to correct you if you're wrong. She has the package.
Silvestrini wanted to tap Bergoglio. In that 2005 conclave, I mentioned this in the last video I did about the meaning of the Benedict pontificate. There was a strange moment. I know I'm repeating myself, but it bears repeating. At lunch, after 3 unsuccessful scrutinies, voting attempts to achieve quorum, however, whatever the rules are of voting, they hadn't achieved quorum in the 3 morning scrutinies at the April 2005 conclave after JP2 died. Benedict was the leader, and the persistent second place man in the voting was this Jorge Bergoglio, which no one even knew. They couldn't account for it, allegedly. Vegas didn't know who he was. How is he coming second in the voting? It's not like there are 1,000 electors. There are less than 100 of age. So how is this working? How does it work? Well, they had a little quorum. It was the Gallen group that was continually holding up what looked like an eventuality, a formality, the Benedict election. And at lunch, in between the 3rd and the 4th scrutiny, there was allegedly an arm-in-arm discussion between, Martini? I think it was Martini or Silvestrini and Benedict. I said Martini the other day. Which neither of those two guys would have had much to discuss with Benedict. Neither of them would, between the 3rd and 4th scrutiny or any time. So this was strange. People were surprised. Fellow prelates were surprised to see this close quarters communication. And lunch broke. They went back, and it appears that most or all of the Gallen group's voting contingent was transferred from Bergoglio to Benedict. So what was said during that lunchtime tete-a-tete? Something. It was something momentous. Sorry if you guys don't like speculation. I haven't even said what it was, but it was something that seems to have had the causal power to have enabled the Benedict pontificate go forward. And then, 5th element of Benedict's pontificate, his retirement. It's sad, but it's true that the most notable thing Benedict XVI will have left us with is that a pope will retire. And he didn't retire like, who was it? Gregory the 12th had retired 600 years before in order, he retired 600 years before in order to end basically a second Avignon papacy kind of dispute. He ceded the throne because it was needed to be done. Most of the other analysis on retired popes, the few times it's ever happened, were young incompetents. Benedict was not a young incompetent. Benedict had been CDF under JP2 for 24 or 25 of 27 years. He was number 2 in the church. Yes, he was more professor than an administrator. Everyone knows that. Don't write that in the comments. I know. But he was an insider. He'd been at the council. He knew the third secret of Fatima as CDF. He knew where the proverbial bodies were buried. He was, in his first 3 years as Pope anyway, doing a good job. He was cleaning up the molestation. He did handle McCarrick and take him out of commission. Ultimately and effectively. He was being a better Pope than JP2 had been, and I don't think much of the pontificate of JP2. He started out strong. He declared a firm war on relativism. He was a great teacher as pontificate. You'll hear these people say that are trying to defend Benedict. I guess they'd say I'm kind of attacking him, but there's an irony because they say, well, he wasn't a good Pope or administrator. He was more of a teacher. I said, no, that's part of the job. And guess what? The Regensburg Address was beautifully succinct, beautifully clear. He did not write long, flitty, poetic sentences. He made the history of philosophy over the last 500 years clear to me. You don't have to waste your time with Spinoza and Descartes and Bacon and Hobbes and Hume and all of the rationalist modernists and the empiricist modernists. If you just read the Regensburg Address, especially if you're not a philosopher. He was a great teacher, and that's part of the job of the pontiff, my friends, in the age of technology. That's part of the new evangelization. He was doing a better job of it, in my view, than John Paul II ever had. So he came out strong. But the fifth element of his pontificate, the retirement, his ceding his role as the protector of the lambs of Rome, letting the wolves of Rome into sanctum sanctorum, is the most defining feature, even though he started out with 3 beautiful, strong, historical, thematic components. Man, he had his powder dry. But he retired. Mysteriously. Don't tell me otherwise. You know I'm not an angry hothead guy, but don't tell me otherwise. It was mysterious. When someone retires and says, look, I'm old. I'm 85. He wasn't lying about that, by the way. The last pontifical mass I saw him at, he would do masses just for the 7 pontifical universities of Rome. It was a privilege. Remember, Steph, he was slumped over in his seat. He looked like a corpse. I'm not saying he wasn't tired, but that's what it was. He was tired. He still had a sharp mind like a tack, Teutonic intellect that was still firing on all 4s. He was tired. You do not retire a lifelong office. It's not even an office. It's a chair, a throne of Peter, because you're tired. He knew he wasn't dying. And he told us that he was dying.
I remember actually during that was it that mass or another mass that somebody, remember when he was walking down the aisle to the altar and somebody tried to attack him? And he actually shook that off pretty well.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
Hey, did a little judo throw. I mean, not really, but yeah, he was fine. It was clear his health was fine. He was tired. One does not retire from the highest office. When you're Pontifex Maximus, the bridge between heaven and earth, like what Constantine had falsely thought he was, the Pope really was. And when you're that bridge between heaven and earth, the highest office, you do not retire because you're sleepy. That was a psyop. That was a lie. And with every year that Benedict survived over these last strange, befuddling 10 years of the Francis pontificate, parish orphans and retrogrades. Every year it gets 1 unit stranger. He retired because he said he was dying. Well, he was sleepy. I like the man. I love the man. I went to Rome and lived and brought my young family and quit my job to study in a foreign language because of that man, largely. So I don't talk about Benedict much because Benedict XVI, even before he died earlier this morning, is a painful subject for me. He's a painful subject for most of us, if we're being honest. He's a complex topic. He's an unhealed wound. It's like a wound that just scabs over, then the scab breaks open, pus issues forth again, like the day after you got it. He's an open wound. What happened with Benedict remains an open book. He was supposed to be the barrier to the New World Order. He was supposed to be a protecting shepherd, and he was doing a fair job. Then the Vade leaks thing happened with Benedict's butler, and intrigue spills back into our lives. Did he do it on purpose? That would have been kind of based. If he tasked his butler to do Vade leaks, some have speculated that. The Vatican Bank had tens, hundreds of millions missing as connected with Vade leaks, and then a few months later he retires. Is this retirement a retirement by agreement dating back to the April 2005 conclave, specifically between the third and the fourth scrutiny? Sorry, these are not crackpot ramblings. These are sensible speculations. I'm not a crackpot, so I don't say I know. I'm saying I think these have much to do with the events of the last 10 years, 15 years, 18 years, whatever it is, since 2005, since Benedict became Pope. But then crank your timeline back 9 more years, because the St. Gallen Mafia knew about him since I was 15 years old in 1996 when they started meeting. Could this all be related to Fatima? Could it all be related to... It's a rabbit hole. So it's not easy. Be charitable with me here on New Year's Eve, my friends. It's not easy to do an honest show on Benedict XVI and be, sickly sweet. Well, sickly sweet is always what we avoid, because that means dishonesty. This show is about honesty. I love this man. I pray for this man. His pontificate is not one that's like a bulwark, a rock against which a wave breaks, like Leo XIII or like Pius X. That was not what Benedict XVI was, and we thought we had a 21st century Leo XIII or Pius X. Now, he did some of that stuff, but kind of like his own favored CDF, Cardinal Mueller. He'll be strong, then he'll be weak. Then he'll be strong, then he'll be weak. Then he'll be strong, then he'll be weak. Even in the last 10 years, he often, publicly anyway, supported Francis. How do you do this? Another one of the marks of, as the deep church goes, the marks of Benedict's pontificate, it's not one of these 5, is that he said we live in an age of absconding fathers, or something like that. Well, he said that, and then he absconded, our father Benedict. And when he absconded and he was sort of keeping contact with his kids, with his flock, a little bit, every once in a while we'd hear from him, and we were left with this abusive stepfather called Francis. And he'd be like, oh, your stepfather's great. He's doing a great job. No, he's not. You hurt us. We love you. We still love you. We loved you all along, Benedict. And you left us to this. On New Year's Eve of 2023, I would just say, my friends, as I always say, I tell you guys a lot about 14th Amendment, about Aristotelianism as it applies to America, about the American Republic is being lied about by both the Straussians, who say it's perfect on one side, and the post-liberals who say it's been rotten from the very beginning on the other. I tell you things that I know about. I don't know, and I never have known over the last 9 years and 10 months since, what was it, February the 27th, 2013. I was working as an oil and gas landman, finishing up law school. I was a landman. And it was strange, that 2013 conclave. It was stranger than the 2005 conclave, which had given us Benedict. Did you know I was at my desk? And I was clicking the Pope page on Wikipedia, which was, at the time, it occurred to me, as the best way. We had a media room at Aaron. I was free to get up from my desk and go check it. I was doing that, but I had to give the appearance of doing some landman work. I couldn't just wait for hours because they didn't know if the new Pope was going to issue the smoke from the Vatican now in 10 minutes or in 10 hours. And one time I clicked refresh, and this has been written about on the internet, by the way. I was a first-hand witness. And the Pope was announced Angelo Scola, the Comunione et Liberazione candidate, who was supposed to be more in line with Benedict, a kind of reform of the Reformed conservative. And I was pumped. It stayed up for about 4 minutes, and then it was swiped. He was considered the most papabile. What happened? I don't know. What ended up happening, publicly anyway, was number 2 from the 2005 conclave, unknown, intentionally unknown. The one that Cardinal Martini said was the only one liberal enough to do to the church what we want to do to it. He ended up getting the chair. And it wasn't 10 hours later. It was when I left for my lunch break. I heard it on local radio. I heard a guy that I was kind of friends with because I'd had a little radio AM show in Bakersfield. His name was Jazz McKay. I follow him on Twitter. I think he follows me. Jazz McKay, who is not a Catholic, he's like a Bakersfield redneck conservative guy. Cool guy. He doesn't know anything about Catholicism. He, as I was turning left onto Crabapple, Steffi, our old home, yeah. He said they've got the smoke. It's a Jesuit, and I said, oh no. It's a South American, and I said, oh no. And his name, and he took the name of Francis, and I said, oh no. And it only got worse from there. And I have disliked this choice of the cardinalate from the jump. I was making a left turn into my neighborhood on that day in 2013. And, would that it had been Angelo Scola. Would instead that Benedict just wouldn't have left. That he wouldn't have done that. You might, because people do this. People get phony when a good man dies. Maybe he's even a holy man. I don't know. I do love Benedict though. I still love him, but I'm not a phony. I'm never just gonna give you the the tarted up version of the truth. Oh, because it's a day. It's an unwritten rule. If Zion Williamson closes out the Phoenix Suns in the last seconds of the game with a 360 windmill dunk, and the Phoenix Suns want to fight the New Orleans Pelicans, this happened a couple weeks ago, I was at the game. They want to fight them because they say that's an unwritten rule. You don't do a fancy dunk when you already got the win. I don't follow unwritten rules, man. I follow the written rules. The natural law, well, those are unwritten. That's not what they mean, though. I don't find that kind of unwritten rule compelling. You tell the truth about a man. He started out with the greatest pontificate of my life, which isn't saying much, but he started out what could have been one of the great pontificates of all time in his first 3 years. He could have been the great hero of the post-conciliar period. He wanted to reform the reform. He didn't do it enough. Francis, even under his very nose, they're both living together as popes who both have the shoes and wear the white and sign their name Pope 2 at a time. Francis would undo item number 3, Summorum Pontificum, while Benedict was still alive. How much more aggressive is he going to be right now? And by the way, they asked Benedict, why keep the shoes? Why keep the white? Why sign your name? Why keep the fisherman's ring? We talked last show about how the Camerlengo is the one that has to destroy the fisherman's ring of the last pope. Well, there are two guys that have been wearing fisherman's ring for the last 9 years and 10 months. This is not normal. I love Benedict too, but this is not normal. And when I say this is not normal, I mean none of this has been right. None of it's been righteous. None of it's been healthy. Sorry if that offends you. This has not been right. And yes, it is the time to talk about it. Unwritten rules be damned. I love the man. I pray for the man. You should love and pray for the man. But this has been unhealthy. The entire Francis pontificate, yes, very few of you probably disagree there. Where we might start to disagree, and reasonable minds can differ. So I don't block you on Twitter like other Catholics. Why I don't get mad if we disagree, but this is why I cleave strongly to this position. Even though you might disagree, it's important to realize that everything, all the oddity and the toxin that Francis has wrought has had a remote, efficient cause named Benedict XVI. It's wrong what he did to have left us. Steph often jokes about the Jurassic Park meme outside the Tyrannosaur paddock where Lex, the girl, is frantically repeating, he left us, about the one adult in the car when the Tyrannosaurus escapes from his paddock. That's the last 10 years, folks. He left us. Why? We need now the Cardinals to launch a formal inquiry into the retirement of Benedict XVI. Why? We were given a now disproven, factually disproven rationale for his retirement. This is the time to look into it. It wasn't the time when he was, you want to talk to me about timing and inquiries and all that? Now is the time, says I, for a strong inquiry by the Cardinal into what the sweet dickens happened with this retirement. Who forced it? How was it procured? What were the material arrangements? How long had the material arrangements been in place? Was it from the 2005 conclave? What did it have to do with the Vatican Bank? Hundreds of millions going missing. What did it have to do with Vati leaks? What did it have to do with the UN and the NWO? What did it have to do with China? Did it involve McCarrick? These questions need to be asked. And it wasn't appropriate while Benedict still lived. Now it's appropriate. Ask those questions. Yeah, I will take questions. I guess my friend Patrick Coffin, who I speak to often behind the scenes, I haven't spoken to him much since Christmas, announced he's a sede on Twitter. Steph kept saying this, well, what does it mean for the Benedictist Pope people? Well, it's not like the theory is busted. I think they were hoping for the sake of sanitation, a clean situation room. They were hoping that Francis would die before Benedict. That cleans it up for Benedict as Pope. But in fairness, I don't jump into condemning these people. I will say their theory is not propositionally busted now, the way some people seem to think. Yes, they become sedevacantists the same way. At the very least, everyone's a sedevacantist in between death of a pope and smoke of a new one. So that's, yeah, and Patrick's not running from that. Yes, I'll take questions, sure.
Let me go ahead and read Patrick's tweet, just so we're clear on what he said. He tweeted this 2 hours ago on Twitter this morning. He said, "The Pope has entered eternity, RIP. The impeded see is now vacant. May the pre-2013 Cardinals do the right thing and avoid yet another anti-Pope."
I mean, I love Pat. I think he has worked behind the scenes toward that end. The pre-2013 Cardinals should do what he's recommending. I don't get the certitude. I love you, Pat. I talk to you 20 times as much behind the scenes as I do in front of a camera. I just don't get the certitude. Look, we know the CIA messed around and found out with regard to JFK. That's no longer a conspiracy theory. I've been into that since I was in the 8th grade. I still don't say certainty. I'm just not an epistemic launchpad guy. I think this needs to be looked into. I don't get when people are even 70% sure and they're like, well, this is what I know happened. 70% ain't 99. Any
Yes.
super chats?
There are people are talking about the set of a contest question. Some new viewers here, and they're asking specifically, what is an anti-pope, and what is a set of a contest?
Cool. Eve, this channel always needs new supporters. Please do so on Patreon. If you want to ask a question, we'll take super chats first. I don't call this out often because I don't like to talk about the money, but if you go to timothyjgordon.com, you can become a patron, even a $5 patron. In 2023, we're doing tons of cool new stuff. Book groups, watching clubs, free stuff occasionally. That's if you want to get something. If you want to help me, the man, because I have a daughter with very expensive health insurance, and you want to give a one-time donation, it's a donor box. If you don't want to do those two things, we'll take super chats. It's December the 31st. It helps. And this is what we do now. So an anti-pope is any pope that is by some significant or not insignificant quorum of churchmen taken to be pope. Taken pseudo-magisterially to be pope. During the Avignon papacy, we had 2 Frenchmen claiming the pontificate in Avignon, France, where the seat of the pontificate had moved, and 1 Roman claiming the pontificate at once. 3 men claiming the pontificate, and they had roughly equal shares of the faithful pledging fidelity before that man's name. Anti-pope situation, and we've had 29 or 30 anti-popes. 2 of those were from Avignon papacy, and it was later declared to be the Italian. But 2 of those 29 or 30 happened then, and guess what? It only gets cleaned up decades later. The Avignon papacy wasn't cleared up for 65, 70 years. So people lived entire lives. That was nearly 2 lifespans back then. Lifespan was about 40 years, average. There was nearly 2 lifespans of Catholics, 2 full generations that went through life not knowing whether one of 2 Frenchmen or an Italian was pope. Because anti-popes are real and because the correction of the confusion only comes post hoc, only comes retroactively, it is never impossible that this man that we currently think is pope, if there's another one that has any of the indicia of being pope, might actually not be pope. It might be the other one with the indicia of it. So you can't rule it out the way you get hothead Benedictist Pope people saying, oh, I know. I'm not talking about Pat. I'm not talking about Ed Mazza. These guys are good, very good dudes and very good Catholic dudes. I just mean there's others, that get hot-headed. And then there are people that get hot-headed back. Why not? This is my appeal to you folks out there, parish orphans and retrogrades. I don't claim to know nothing. I'm not Socrates of Athens. I know a bit about 4 main themes. I've written 4 books, but those aren't the exact 4. The 4 or 5 themes, they apply to life in the world and life in the church with a lot of news. You can apply it to the news. That's why I come before you 3 times a week, and I'm pretty much talking about one of those 4 themes. I'm not claiming I know nothing. I'm honest. I don't know enough to be certain about an anti-pope. I don't have a DeLorean that travels forward or backward in time. That's what you need to be certain, for or against. Francis is the weirdest pope we've ever had, and weird in a bad way. Sometimes weird is good. Zion Williamson is a weird basketball player. He's built like a refrigerator, and he can jump 44 inches and windmill dunk. That's weird, but that's good. Francis is not Zion Williamson. He's weird, and he's bad, and he's toxic, and he hates us. That I know. I am certain that the Francis pontificate has been really, really bad. No doubt. I would bet everything. I wouldn't bet everything that Benedict has still been pope the whole time. I wouldn't bet everything that he hasn't been Pope the whole time. Any other questions or super chats?
Yes. A question here. Could a sedevacantist, according to the formal definition you gave, ever believe that a future pope could ever be valid?
There are all kinds of theories. No, there aren't all kinds. There are 3 theories, I'd say, maybe 4, for how we could get the conclaves back or we wouldn't need to get conclaves back, imperfect conclaves. I'm not sure because I haven't spent the time. Look, I'm working still in a doctoral program. I do 3 shows on news where giving a constitutional or Thomistic analysis can be helpful. I'm not sure because I haven't looked into how valid I think they are. Private speculation by guys like Bellarmine, who I do respect, who I have studied Bellarmine's political work quite a lot. I talk about Bellarmine a lot if I'm talking about America's foundation. I don't know enough to be certain or anywhere near certain as to whether or not too much time passing with a sede vacante would just bust the church, or whether or not it would destroy the visibility mark of the church, or whether it would leave the church open to rehabilitation, the way the sedevacantists claim. Or maybe some sedevacantists say, I'm more skeptical here. The church can go forward without a pope. No, I don't think so. The pope is one of the ontological indicia of the visibility of the church. So I think you need a pope, which means you need some way to get a pope, which wasn't always conclaves until 500 or 600 years in, but it's been conclaves. I don't know how it changes. I don't know how the magisterium works that way. Our church lacks constitutional clarity. We have a great U.S. Constitution, whether you know it or not, that has clarity for how these things happen. Freemasons have just been ignoring it since the 1940s on the court. The church doesn't have such a clear constitution. Its magisterium doesn't work that way. They change it when they want to change it, and we have to accept the authority. I don't favor that. That means I don't know. We'll see. Maybe in our lives. Pairs, orphans, and retrogrades, Happy New Year. Hold your family close, love them. Pray for Pope Benedict Emeritus the 16th. And let's wait and see. God's got us in his peripheral vision. No matter what happens, he's got us in his peripheral vision. Better days ahead. Happy 2023. Deus Volt.